Ben Walker, a street cop, was bathed in a warm glow as the sun descended over a peaceful suburban area. Now retired, he cautiously made his way to the neighborhood animal shelter, his thoughts racing with recollections of his time on. Ben hadn't seen Coda's police department, his dependable German Shepherd partner, who had saved his life several times. Coda hasn't been retired by the department for over 2 years due to an injury, but today the shelter called to rekindled his optimism that they might have discovered Coda within the shelter because the atmosphere was. Ben went up to the receptionist, who greeted him, surrounded by the muffled sounds of barking and the smell of disinfectant. "Mr. Walker, I believe we have someone you've been searching for," she remarked, smiling politely as she led him down a. Ben froze as they arrived at the final cage-lined corridor. A big German Shepherd with brown and black fur was lying in the corner, and his ears perked up at the sound of footsteps, but his body was motionless, and his eyes were suspicious and far away. "Coda, Ben," he spoke in a tremulous whisper, and the dog turned his head but kept his eyes fixed on him. Was vacant, without the acknowledgement Ben had so desperately sought. "He had no memory of me." When the staff member unlocked the cage, Ben mumbled and backed away, feeling a knot grow in his throat. His heart raced with feelings he hadn't felt in years as the shelter's familiar aroma, a blend of disinfectant and. His senses were overwhelmed with animal smell as Coda, the German Shepherd who had been his loyal companion, stepped in front of him. Coda was different from other police officers. His body was tight, and his eyes were far away, as though he were a stranger in a. "Coda," Ben muttered in a familiar location, his voice shaking with anguish, and he took a. Cautiously moved closer, his boots making a faint echoing sound on the concrete floor, and Coda's ears perked up in recognition. But instead of approaching Ben, he kept his tail low and his PO stiff. "Here is Ben. We discovered him abandoned at another facility," the shelter worker added quietly, "so whomever had him must have." Ben's chest constricted as he tried to manage his anxiousness, indicating that he no longer readily trusts people. He looked, observing Coda's body and the faint indications of his previous little wounds on his muzzle. The way he kept his weight off his hind limb and the somewhat matted fur that suggested neglect were probably remnants of it. Ben muttered more to himself than to the employee. He knelt down to Coda's because of an earlier injury that didn't affect him like this. Level slowly holding out a hand. "Coda, it's me, Ben." The dog's eyes flitted to him. For a brief moment, Ben believed he saw a glimmer of recognition in his amber eyes as they searched for anything familiar. However, it vanished as soon as it seemed, and Coda turned his head away, protecting the rejection with his body language. Ben didn't want to acknowledge that this wasn't how their reunion was intended to happen. He had imagined Cod running in. He licked his fingers and wiggled his tail with the same unbridled joy he used to display following a successful mission. Except that. Would you prefer to spend time with a dog who was troubled by memories Ben couldn't fully understand in place of the Coda version? When they were outside with him, the shelter worker noticed the tension in the air and said that sometimes the fresh air helped them feel a little more relaxed. Ben agreed, appreciating the recommendation. "So let's." They relocated to the play yard, a tiny walled space behind the shelter, to give it a try. As Coda cautiously entered the open area, Ben remained at a distance. The dog sniffed the ground to track his movements. Ben sat on a weathered bench and watched him, his head tilting purposefully at every sound as memories flooded his thoughts. During stressful surgeries, Coda's harsh bark pierces the night as he dashes through obstacle courses and the comfort of his constant presence in times of doubt. But Coda now appeared to be a shadow of the person he used to be. "Odie," Ben called. A tennis ball was gently thrown in his direction. It rolled to a stop a few feet from the dog, who only looked at. Ben moaned and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees before beginning his cautious examination again. "I don't," he said in a low voice. "You saved my life. I'm not sure if you remember me, but I do remember you." The words, "I won't give up on you," hung in the air more times than I can remember. Coda, carried away by a light wind, sniffed the ball once, but chose not to pick it up, instead turning his head in the direction of the. As the sun sank lower in the sky, he heard another dog barking in the distance, which made his ears perk up a little. Ben decided to paint the yard in shades of orange and gold once he got up from the bench. and went up to the shelter worker. "I'm taking him home," he declared firmly. "Are you sure?" the worker asked. "Hune will require a great deal of care and patience. He is not the same dog that he was before." Ben nodded. "And neither am I, but I owe it to him. I won't give up on him now, just as he didn't give up on me back then, so give it a shot." After signing the paperwork and making the necessary arrangements, Ben LED Coda led the puppy to his truck. Smelling the edge of the open tailgate, he hesitated before slowly getting in. Ben had spread a cozy blanket in the hopes of making the journey as comfortable as possible. The drive home was peaceful, with just occasional interruptions. Ben watched Coda through the rearview mirror as the dog rested with his head down as the engine hummed. When they reached Ben's humble home, he was lying on his paw and staring at the passing landscape. The property was quiet, but Coda hesitated once again as he got out of the pickup on the outskirts of town, his body tight. Despite being surrounded by trees and vast space, Coda found it strange and full of unknowns. Ben guided him inside while maintaining his. He had prepared a cozy corner in the living room with a soft bed, a bowl of water, and a few items. His motions were slow and methodical. He gestured to the arrangement and remarked, "Toys, this is your spot." Coda smelled the air, but instead of going to the corner, he lingered close to the door, his body language showing caution. Ben sighed and ran a hand, more to himself than to the dog. "You'll come around," he muttered through his hair. Ben left his bedroom door open that evening as he got ready for bed in the hopes that, when the lights went dark and Coda heard the gentle sound of a paw on the floor, he might feel secure enough to approach. He avoided looking at the hardwood floor so as not to frighten the Coda away, but he had a slight feeling of. It wasn't much, but it was a start when he heard the dog rest close to the doorway. The following morning, Ben woke up to his eyes adapted to the early light coming in through the blinds as he heard a slight movement in the corridor. Noticed Coda seated close to the doorway, and the German Shepherd's amber eyes were fixed on him with a brief moment of interest. For the first time since their reunion, it was evident beneath his reserved demeanor that Coda didn't instantly back down when Ben. "Good morning," Coda, Ben muttered quietly as he slowly sat up. He didn't approach, allowing the dog to initiate contact, but Coda eventually turned and padded back to the corner of Ben's side in the living room, aware that this voyage would take more patience than he had anticipated, but he was determined to make progress. Ben prepared breakfast in the morning and positioned Coda's food bowl close to his living room setting. Ben made a plan he required, but he didn't stay in the room, allowing the dog to eat at his own leisure. An hour later, to awaken Coda's memory and restore the connection they once had. From his closet, Ben took out a box that included mementos from his time on the force, medals, and a worn-out. An ancient rubber ball with its edges in the bottom of the box was a collar that had belonged to Coda while they're active duty. Holding it in his palm, torn from innumerable retrieve games, brought back memories of Coda's unrelenting. Even after exhausting shifts, this ball kept pushing it in Ben's direction for another round. Ben took the ball outdoors too. Coda was sniffing the fence's margins in the backyard when he softly shouted out, "Look what I found." He rolled the ball, approaching the dog while keeping a close eye out for any response. Coda stopped and listened. He lowered his head and twitched as the ball came to rest at his feet, giving the impression that he might engage. Smelling the familiar item, Ben took a step back and retreated to a tree's shade, which made his heart sink. He sat down and covered his disappointment by saying, "It's okay, boy. We'll try again later." Observing Coda from the porch while the dog reclines in the shade, his eyes averted. As the day went on, Ben occupied himself with household tasks while monitoring Coda whenever he could. Slight adjustments in the way the dog would follow him, his ears perking up at specific noises, these tiny cues, gave Ben optimism, even though he was aware that the journey ahead would be lengthy. That evening, as the sun set, Ben made the decision to. He took Coda's old harness out of the same crate to attempt something more recognizable. The one they used for training exercises was solid despite its faded cloth, which was a witness to the innumerable. Ben knelt down and held the harness in one hand while extending the other, recalling the missions it had survived in the backyard. Regarding Coda, "Do you recall this friend with whom we used to practice daily?" Coda's ears perked up and he cocked his head in a soft, almost beseeching tone. Ben put the harness on the ground after briefly believing he saw a flash of recognition in the dog's eyes, and moved aside to give Coda room to approach the German Shepherd, who warily sniffed the air before creeping closer to the. Ben muttered, "Object, take your time." He watched every action with bated breath. Coda bent down and sniffed the harness carefully. His tail wagged slightly, not very apparent, but enough to make. Ben's heart leaped, but Coda swiftly pulled back, tucking his tail. Ben let out a deep breath between his legs as he returned to his shaded area, attempting to contain his annoyance as he was aware that Coda's scars were more than simply physical. They were both haunted by ghosts. That evening, Ben sat on the couch with the puppy, knowing that it would take more than a familiar object to get him to come out of his shell. Coda, who was lying a few feet away, switched on the television and let the room fill with the soothing sound of background noise while he looked. "I owe you everything, Coda. You saved my life more times than I can count," he said tenderly to the dog. As the hours went by, the tension in the room started to lessen, and Coda wished that I could do the same for you. Moved a little closer to Ben's feet, but he remained safe. Ben didn't move in observance of the dog's limits, but in the midst of the night, Ben felt a glimmer of hope that they were moving closer to pro status. He turned his head slightly, his eyes adjusting to the sudden sound of paws' gentle patting on the floor. The veteran remained motionless in the dim light as Coda stood close to the couch, his nose just inches from Ben's hand. Coda stopped, his breath warm against Ben's fingers, then touched his nose lightly, not wanting to frighten the dog. Coda swiftly withdrew and returned to his corner, but the moment in the man's palm was brief. "You're still in there, aren't you?" Ben said, his voice heavy with passion, enough to make his chest ache. For the first time since bringing Coda home, Ben felt thankful and hopeful that their relationship may be restored. The dawn brought a small stride that was weighed down by 1,000 memories and silent vows. Ben regained his resolve when he woke up and seen Coda laying close to the. There was something softer about the dog's presence at the living room entryway, even if he still maintained a noticeable distance. His gaze was less guarded, and his ears weren't pinched back. Stretching to avoid drawing attention to himself, he strolled nonchalantly to the kitchen and made his tea and coffee. A fresh dish of food was placed close to Coda's corner, and the German Shepherd observed him without making a huge show of it. He didn't go straight for the bowl, but his amber eyes were closely monitoring Ben's every move. "I understand, buddy Ben." Ben sipped his coffee and muttered, "You don't trust me yet, but we'll get there throughout the morning." He took care to avoid crowding the tiny tasks around the house while constantly remaining in Coda's line of sight. Dog or make abrupt motions, but instead he shared occasionally in a quiet voice. Commonplace ideas as though Coda were a long-lost friend he was attempting to get back in touch with, Ben stated, laughing out loud while he arranged the tools in the garage. "Perhaps we'll go to the park later for some fresh air." "Good. What do you think?" Coda stayed in his position close to the door, although he cocked his head slightly as Ben's voice was heard. Granted, it wasn't much, but by early afternoon, Ben felt like he was making progress. When Ben made the decision to jump, he took a leash from the same box of memories he had used throughout the day. Previously, the leather was firm despite being worn, and the metal clip that was holding it in his hands was softly sparkling in the sunlight. Training sessions, tense situations, and the unshakable bond they previously shared are all filled with memories. Held the leash out in front of him while kneeling a few feet away from Coda and calling to him in a gentle, welcoming voice. But not harshly. "How about we take a walk? The dog's ears will be a little more alert." Ben put the leash on the ground and retreated, allowing Coda the option to approach on, but his body remained stiff. For a considerable amount of time, the dog merely gazed at his tail and the leash. Ben encouraged the boy as he twitched slightly before moving tentatively forward and sniffing the object. Coda looked up at Ben, his eyes impassive, and he continued to speak steadily. "How do you remember this, don't you?" Careful not to move abruptly, he grabbed the leash, connected it to Coda's collar, and gently pulled. He was relieved that Coda didn't fight back, but his stance remained cautious as they went outdoors. Ben slowed down the pace so Coda could lead the dog and sniff the ground, his ears turning with every noise. But he moved about the yard without panic, allowing Coda some time to get used to it before going past the gate until they eventually arrived at the gravel path that led to. Ben experienced a wave of nostalgia in the neighboring park because he hadn't traveled this path with Coda in years. Yet the soft rustle of foliage, the faraway hum of cicadas, the familiar footfall, the sound of gravel crunching beneath their feet gave the impression that time had reversed itself. However, Coda appeared less relaxed. His head swiveled and his body stayed rigid. Ben maintained a firm yet delicate hold on the leash, quietly reassuring the animal that everything would be all right at every rustle and shadow. "We're safe here, boy." When they arrived at the park, Ben noticed a quiet area where he unclipped the leash so they could sit quietly and Coda could go around. The German Shepherd first paused, looking back at Ben as though he was asking for permission, and then he took hesitant steps. Ben silently observed his heart, enlarging with a mixture of hope as he started to scent the grass and trees surrounding him. Although melancholy, Coda's motions were purposeful, almost systematic, as though he were recording each sound and aroma. It reminded Ben of their time on the force, when their best strength had been Coda's keen senses. After some while, Ben pulled. Coda was shown a tiny rubber ball he took out of his pocket, the same one he had attempted to use the day before. "What do you think Buddy wants to try before rolling it a few feet over the grass?" Coda stopped and listened. For an instant, it appeared as though he might overlook the ball as he flicked ahead, but Ben was shocked as the dog took a few. He took tentative steps in its direction, sniffed the ball, picked it up in his jaws, and carried it back to Ben. As he stretched out to grab the ball, he felt his throat constriction. "Good boy," he muttered, his voice full with emotion. "Remember how they played a slow, timid game of fetch for the next hour?" Every time Coda gave the ball, his motions gained a bit more self-assurance, and he began to wave his tail, slightly. It was a start as the sun started to drop, but it wasn't the same joy Ben recalled from their time together. Ben bent down and put a palm on Coda's head, sprinkling the park with golden hues. The dog leaned into the touch of his amber eyes rather than pulling away. Meeting Ben with a hint of recognition, Ben remarked quietly, "One step at a time. We're getting there, partner." The ensuing days were a delicate dance of advancements and disappointments. Every minor triumph with Coda provided a glimpse of hope, but the obstacles he had established over time remained solid. So Ben committed himself to repairing their relationship. But one morning he couldn't get rid of the sensation that Coda was being held back by something as profound as the gentle light of. Ben saw Coda standing by the fence as the sun began to peek over the yard. The German Shepherd's posture was attentive, as though he sensed something just by being perked up and twitching his nose at the air. Ben crouched down and approached the area beyond the fence gently, so as not to scare the youngster. "What's out there?" Ben said. The dog didn't react to Coda's level. Instead, he kept his attention on the horizon. It was uncommon for Coda to seem tense, but this time there was a strain in his posture that Ben hadn't noticed previously. Ben chose to take Coda for another stroll that day, and they went to the park by the same path. The rhythmic crunch of Ben's thoughts were grounded by the gravel beneath his feet, and Coda's movements were less tentative now, though he still stopped. As they entered the park, Ben detected something strange. A man in a dark suit, and began to sniff the air regularly, his body tight. Hoodie was loitering close to the tree line, closely observing them, and Ben's intuition, sharpened by years of service in law enforcement, instantly took over as he tightened his hold on Kay's leash, his eyes narrowing as he watched the man's movements, and Coda appeared to notice his ears as well. The first sound he had made since getting to Ben's place was a low growl as he flattened slightly. The man swiftly turned and vanished into the woods after realizing he had been observed, sending a shiver down Ben's spine. "It's all, buddy," Ben whispered quietly as he knelt next to Coda and put a comforting hand on his back. "Hune's gone, but Ben was uneasy about the encounter, wondering who that man was and why Coda had responded so forcefully. As they made their way home that evening, Ben's thoughts continued to linger with the questions, so he made the decision to learn more about. He obtained the file he was given upon adopting Coda and scanned the pages for any hints. The majority of the data consisted of routine behavioral notes and vaccination records, but one portion, the words that burned his ears, were transferred from out-of-state shelter due to abandonment and aggression issues. and Ben's thoughts were racing with potential explanations for why Coda had been abandoned and what had transpired with him during that period. We're committed to finding the truth, so Ben called a couple former co-workers who might know documents from Coda's tenure in the military. After several hours of research, he eventually found a lead that Coda had been transferred to. After Ben departed the force, the collaboration with another handler didn't last long, and Coda was ultimately turned over to A. Ben was devastated by the news. He couldn't fathom Coda with another handler, much less being left behind. Described in great detail the skepticism, anxiety, and hesitation to connect Coda that had been through more than he had anticipated, and the weight of that information strengthened his determination. The following day, Ben made the decision to adopt a different strategy. Rather than pressuring Coda to re-establish a connection with their shared history, he concentrated on developing new in order to harness Coda's innate intelligence and drive. He constructed a little obstacle course in the yard. Coda was initially hesitant as he watched Ben set up the apparatus, feeling both intrigued and suspicious, but as Ben encouraged and gently praised him as he progressed through the course, and the German Shepherd started interacting with each. Coda's eyes glowed with delight after a good maneuver, and by the end of the lesson, he was navigating the challenges with ease. "You're a natural friend," Ben remarked with a smile as Coda finished the last obstacle as they sat together on the final hurdle that evening, exactly like old times. But Ben couldn't get the man in the park out of his mind. Something about the interaction had seemed strange in Coda's. His anxiety was heightened by this response, so he made the decision to place a few security cameras across the property as a precaution. Ben was looking over the film from the night before the next morning when he noticed something strange about. At midnight, a shadowy figure emerged close to the yard's edge, lingered there for a few minutes, and then vanished inside. Ben's stomach constricted in the woods. Was this the same man from Coda Park? Seeing Ben was uncomfortable. The dog sat next to him, which was reassuring. However, it also made Ben realize how important it was to defend Coda as much as Coda had, regardless of the circumstances, shielded him previously. Later that day, Ben got a call from a former coworker, so I looked into it. The speaker on the telephone said, "There's more to the story than what's in the official records," referring to Cox's former handler. Wished to visit and speak with Ben, but his hold on the phone increased. "I'll be there while he ended the call and glanced at Coda's, who was lying by the window. He peered around the yard, saying, "Looks like we have more work to do, boy. But we'll work this out together," Ben stated as he arrived at the precinct. Later that afternoon, he was troubled by a flurry of conjecture after receiving a call from his former coworker. But resolute, he looked at Coda in the back seat of his truck as he parked it. German Shepherd's ears were up, and he was looking around with the same level of awareness that he had displayed on the force. Ben was welcomed inside by a subliminal reminder of the dog Coda used to be and the companion he was desperate to bring back. One of the few people who recognized the connection between him and Coda Daniels was his lifelong friend, Officer Daniels. Thanked Ben Daniel for coming in motion for him to join him into a tiny, disorganized office at the rear of the station. I was able to retrieve some unofficial documents on Coda's reassignment and what transpired, they replied, locking the door behind them. He then gave Ben a tiny folder, which the veteran slowly opened with his eyes. The majority of the information in the scant notes was familiar from Coda's service commendations for his gallantry. Ben, however, paused when he read about an incident that happened when Coda was with his second handler. The dog was declared fit for duty after he allegedly reacted violently during a routine operation, earning him the designation of liability. Daniels clarified that the handler didn't want to deal with him because of his strong tone and Ben's hold on the Coda was the most reliable partner I've ever had, and the folder tightened the liability. Daniels nodded, and that's what I said. There must be more to this. According to someone who worked with that handler, the man wasn't exactly friendly to his dogs, Coda, to put it mildly. The comment struck Ben like a kick to the stomach when he thought of Coda, and he most likely behaved out because of how he was treated. Being mistreated was nearly intolerable, which greatly contributed to the anxiety that Ben's jaw tightened as he mistrusted the barriers Coda had erected around himself. He felt a wave of sorrow and rage. Perhaps if he had remained on the force, he could have shielded Coda from all of. Ben whispered more to himself than to Daniels. "I should have been there. You can't blame yourself anymore. Ben Daniels stated emphatically. You didn't know? And the fact that you're here now is what counts. Provided minimal consolation, but they took away Ben's determination. So he folded the folder and put it under his arm. Thank you, Daniel's eye. Ben's thoughts was racing as he exited the precinct, and he needed to concentrate on. Not only did Coda treat the dog's emotional and physical injuries, but he also restored the trust that had been broken. But that night back at the house, Ben's thoughts were still haunted by the image of the man in the park. He made the decision to attempt a different strategy and created a peaceful area in the living room to block out distractions and create an. He pulled out a little box of things he had collected during their time on the force, including a used leash, and Kodo observed from the corner of the room, wearing an old training whistle and a badge he had worn on his collar on missions. The veteran knelt on the floor, laying out the goods one by one while keeping an eye on Ben's every move. He held up the blasts and whistled, using the same signal he used on missions too. Koda's ears perked up in astonishment, and the dog paused for a second before taking a. Ben took a tentative step forward, remaining motionless with a racing heart while Koda sniffed the air, his nose twitching. Ben murmured softly, "You remember, don't you?" as it detected the familiar fragrance of the leash and badge. He moved slowly and deliberately as he got closer to the objects, sniffing the insignia and cocking his head slightly as though. Ben felt a knot form in his throat as he attempted to solve a riddle that was buried deep within his memory. This was the first time Koda had demonstrated any genuine ties to their history. The sound of rustling outside Koda's ears cut off the moment. Ben kept his ground as he roared up and turned to face the window. He turned on the porch light to illuminate the yard as he approached the door, following his instincts, but he saw nothing out of the norm. But Koda's snarl was enough to make Ben nervous. "It's all right, Koda Ben." He turned to the living room and locked the door behind him. He stayed near the window, his body tight. Kneeling next to him, the German stated, "No matter what, we'll deal with it together." Instead of unwinding, Shepard moved a little closer to Ben in a nuanced gesture that conveyed a lot of meaning. It seemed as though Koda was, despite the persistent shadows of his past from that night, I'm starting to trust him again. Ben couldn't get rid of the sensation that the details of Koda's story were gradually fitting together as he lay in bed. His second handler's abuse, the park encounter with the stranger, the fleeting glimpses of recognition, everything appeared related, but Ben uttered a silent sound as sleep finally took him, promised that he would do whatever it takes to unearth the truth and bring Koda peace because the dog had saved his life innumerable times. It was Ben's turn to repay the favor after his stint on the force. The following morning, Ben. It wasn't unusual for me to wake up to the sound of Koda pacing at the front door, his nails tapping against the wooden floor. The dog to be agitated. But today he moved with a sense of urgency that Ben hadn't noticed before scraping the sleep. Ben put on a sweatshirt and knelt down to meet Koda at the door. "What's up, boy?" Ben inquired. The German shepherd returned his look, his eyes alert and piercing without. Cod clawed at the door and gave a low, urgent bark while he waited for a response. After Ben had retrieved the leash and unlocked the door, Koda scurried out of his. His motions were deliberate and precise. Unlike dogs, he was following a trail rather than smelling randomly. Only he sensed that Ben was right behind him, his interest swiftly shifting to. Concerned, Koda guided him to the yard's edge, pausing close to the fence where the grass had flattened Ben's forehead. His chest constricted when he saw faint footprints in the soil that were too big to be his own. Someone had. The footprint brought back memories of the man in the park. Could it be him? And if so, why would he have done it? Koda snarled softly while standing close to Ben's property, his posture tight, as though he was verifying. Ben squatted down to examine the tracks, confirming his thoughts. "Good boy," he whispered to Koda, steadying the dog with a hand on his back. "Let's see where this goes." Ben, following the trail, observed that it led to the woods behind the house Koda St. He moved cautiously but confidently, as though he knew he was taking them into potentially hazardous areas. And the farther they walked, the more silent the forest grew. After a few minutes, the trail abruptly terminated at a little clearing in the middle, and the birds appeared to hold their breath. An ancient, deserted shed with moss growing on its walls and a partially collapsed roof. Koda halted a short distance away, his body rigid, his ears alert, and he gave a piercing yelp. Ben's instinct urged him to turn around as he stared at the shed, but something about the scene forced him to investigate. Holding tight to the Koda's leash, he gingerly made his way to the shed, where the door hung unevenly on it. As he pushed it open, the hinges creaked noisily, and the air inside was stale and moist. Ben's eyes were confused by the modest stack of blankets in the corner and the few rusting items strewn across the floor. Narrowed when he noticed a metal bowl nearby that contained clean water from a recent visit. Ben felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end as Koda sniffed the air, and his growl grew louder. He took a step closer. Using his foot to push the blankets away from the pile, he discovered a notepad below them, its cover worn, and he snatched it up and turned through the pages, his heart pounding as he noticed the entry's intricate notes and diagrams. Outlined Koda's physical attributes, demeanor, and even his military background. Although one page of the notes was devoted to training methods, the author was aware of Koda's previous. Ben's hold on the notebook was icy and clinical, as though the author considered Koda to be a tool rather than a real individual. Before he could, he mumbled, "What is this?" more to himself than to Koda. Absorbed the information, a noise outside caused him to freeze and slow his steps. Ben's heart pounded as he approached the shed deliberately, instinctively moving to the side of the opening and gesturing for. The dog heeded Koda's command to keep silent, growling and then rumbling softly through a. Ben noticed a shadow approaching from a crevice in the shed's wall. It was the outline of a tall ant. Ben tightened his hands as his thoughts returned to the figure from the park, broad-shouldered and wearing a dark jacket. The man paused just outside the shed, his head cocked slightly as though listening to Ben, adrenaline pumping through him. Koda held his breath while his hand crept toward the tiny knife he always kept on his belt. He stayed still. After what seemed like a lifetime, the man's body coiled like a spring, and he turned to leave, his footsteps fading into. Ben breathed softly as he waited for a few moments in the trees, his limbs shaking from the strain to remain silent. In order to make sure everything was well, Koda sniffed the ground where the man had placed his. Ben knelt next to him, his mouth clenched in resolve, his ears twitching back and forth. "Whoever that was, they knew," he whispered. "I'm going to find out why. Too much about you," as they made. Ben's thoughts on the ride home were a mix of fear, rage, and resolution. Every stride he took made the notebook he was holding feel heavier since someone had been observing them as they studied Koda and perhaps. Ben closed all the windows and doors that night in preparation for something much worse. Koda lay beside the front entrance, his eyes black to every shadow that moved outside. For the first time since their reconnection, their bodies served as a barrier between the house and any threats that could be outside. Although Ben felt safe with Koda around, there were still uncertainties about who. Was the man curious about Koda, and, more significantly, how far would? Ben got up the following day with a fresh sense of purpose after he went to grab what he desired. His thoughts were troubled by the notebook, whose pages contained disturbing information concerning Koda and the enigmatic. Ben realized that even if the figure in the woods had left for the time being, he still had to protect Koda no matter what. After breakfast, Ben quickly went over the notebook once again, taking in the training graphics and clinical notes. Although the entries for recurring Collins didn't include much background, it was obvious that Collins played a big part in Koda's history. Ben's gut turned as he put the pieces of details. Could Collins be the park man? If so, what was he doing tracking? Now that Koda was determined to find out, Ben made the decision to get in touch with an old friend from. Sarah Grayson, a detective on the force, was always resourceful and persistent in her efforts to find. The fact was that she was the one who could help him. A few hours later, Ben stood. With his keen eyes, the dog stayed vigilant outside Sarah's office. Ben knocked on the door while surveying the strange surroundings, and a moment later Sarah showed up, her face lighting up. She said, "It's been years, Ben," and quickly embraced him before turning to look at Koda and herself. Visage softened, and Ben, the notorious coder, nodded with a slight smile. Pulling at his lips, Hune has experienced a lot, and Sarah has signaled for. Ben put the notepad on her desk and told them to come inside. "Well, you're in the right place. Let's figure this out." Outlined in brief all that had transpired since seeing Koda again, The figure at the park, the footprints close to. Sarah rummaged through the notepad, her brow furrowing as she considered his property and the disturbing discovery in the shed. This gets more heated with every page, she whispered to Collins. You said I'll run the. While Ben waited with his fingers, she frantically typed her name through our system to see if anything appeared. Coda sat next to him, tapping uneasily on the armrest of his chair, his ears perking up at the slight hum of the computer. But after a little, while Sarah switched the screen in Ben's direction, this is what I discovered that Mark Collins, a former K-9 handler, was dishonorably released from the force approximately 5 years ago. It appears that in the past, he was known for pushing his dogs too far, even to the. Hune is so fixated on K-9 that Ben's jaw constricted to the point of putting their lives in jeopardy. Sarah grimly nodded, and it appears that there have been tales of him attempting to buy retired kinds from individual owners and shelters. He says it's for rehabilitation, but something. Red flags were raised by his tactics, so Ben tightened his fists and is now pursuing. Coda. Sarah reclined on her chair, her face contemplative. Perhaps Coda. Maybe a unique situation for him, either as a prize or as a component of a bigger scheme, but Collins. Sarah's comments reverberated in Ben's mind as he drove home. Isn't someone you want near him? The dog's eyes were locked on the road as he looked at Coda in the rearview mirror. Don't worry, buddy, Ben added quietly. I won't allow anyone to harm you again. House Ben spent the afternoon strengthening the perimeter of the property because he knew he couldn't leave anything to chance. Coda intently followed him as he added more locks on the windows and doors, serving as a continual reminder of why. Later, when the sun started to drop, same precautions were required. Ben sat on the. Coda was sleeping on the porch, and the only sound to break the stillness of the evening was the rustle of leaves. Ben let his hand rest absently for a moment due to the wind, caressing Coda's fur, but the calm was brief because there was a loud boom and a slight. When a metallic clang broke the silence, the Coda's ears perked up and he ran away. Ben stood up, stiff and alert, and followed his eyes to the edge of the yard, where he could make out the dim silhouette of a figure. Ben's heart pounded as he reached for the flashlight he kept by the door, standing silhouetted against the waning light. When he clicked it on the ray piercing the shadows, the figure remained motionless, perhaps waiting for. Ben ordered the German shepherd to stay still in a low but stern voice. Ben took a careful step forward in the flashlight's glare, obeying even though his body shook with controlled energy, displaying additional information about a man wearing a dark jacket with the hood covering his face. Ben spoke out in a firm voice. What do you want, Collins? Despite the man, with excitement pumping through his veins, took a step back and faded into the shadows of the. Ben knew it was too dangerous to pursue him, so he backed off to trees instead. Coda paced by the window while the house locked the door behind him, his low growls audible. Ben, who was steady, knelt next to him and put a comforting hand on the dog's shoulder. Ben started creating a plan that night, as the home fell into an uncomfortable silence. It's okay, son. We'll work this out. Plan. Collins wasn't going to give up, and the notebook suggested that the man and Coda had a closer relationship. Ben felt he couldn't handle this alone, whatever of his motivations, so he took out his phone and called Sarah, who answered. He wasted no time in getting here. Ben continued, I need you, in a hurried voice. Sarah's voice on the other end of the telephone was resolute. I'll be there, thanks to your assistance. Ben picked up the phone first thing in the morning and looked at Coda, who had finally made himself at home next to the front entrance. We're not alone with his friend, he muttered. Weck, let's get through this together. Morning arrived, under a gloomy, cloudy sky, as though the world itself could feel the anxiety building in Ben's life. Sarah kept her word, arrived early, and parked her inconspicuous vehicle close to Ben's property line. As she emerged, her keen eyes scanned the area, observing the strengthened locks and thin footprints the enigmatic intruder left in the yard. Sarah replied briskly, let's get to work, as she walked toward the porch, her hand naturally resting on her holstered. Coda greeted her with a low growl from his sidearm, still cautious of outsiders. But hey, Ben was standing there, pointing toward the forest line, and his cool motion kept the dog under control. Said nothing but observed me before vanishing into the woods. Sarah nodded, her face grim, and she said, "I'll comb, search the region to see if I can locate anything. And in the interim, let's install some more surveillance to see if Collins is after Coda. We need evidence and a strategy to stop him." While Sarah looked into the yard, Ben installed a set of motion-activated cameras around his property's edge. These little, yet efficient gadgets captured Crisp. Even in both bright and dim lighting, Coda remained with him, his keen eyes searching the area for any movement as Sarah came back after Ben fastened the final camera to a tree. She held up a small metallic trinket, an old dog tag from her sweep of the woods. Sarah remarked, giving it to Ben, "This was buried close to where you saw him." Its edges were worn and carved with the name Rex. Ben's stomach twisted as he turned the tag over in his fingers, wondering if it meant anything to him. Rex had been Collins' dog's agility and intelligence made him a legend among K9 handlers. Yet the dog had allegedly passed away in questionable circumstances years ago. What was Collins doing? Ben added softly that his thoughts was racing because Rex was now his buddy. Ben and Sarah were sitting at the kitchen table that day, pouring out their hearts. And it's not just about Coda. Coda was lying next to the pages from the enigmatic journal, his head resting on his pays, but his ears flicking at. Sarah murmured, tapping a little sound, "This goes deeper than just obsession." Collins was not just pushing his dogs. He was also conducting experiments on them, according to the paragraph that detailed experimental training techniques. They were pushing themselves both mentally and physically, and if Coda was involved, that could help explain why he's so. Ben nodded differently, remembering the dog's keen awareness and remarkable. He has been taught to solve problems and endure in the most extreme circumstances, but this is more than that. Sarah's eyes hardened, and he seemed to stand me up in ways that no other dog could. As nighttime drew near, Collins, who wants that back, saw Coda as his creation. As the tension in the home increased, Coda paced close to the door and growled. Ben's phone buzzed softly but persistently, and he saw that the freshly installed cameras had sent him a notification. He opened the app, and a mysterious figure was hovering just outside the property when one of the cameras near the woods froze and recorded movement. Ben mumbled as he showed Sarah the video, which she took, with the line part partially hidden by the thick trees. Ben shook his head. "No, if it's a radio, stay here with Coda, and I'll check it out. Collins is there for me and Coda, and I won't leave you to deal with him alone in spite of." Ben took a torch and a solid walking staff in response to Sarah's complaints, and with Coda by his side, they moving cautiously and deliberately toward the woods. Their steps were muted by the lush foliage, generating in. As they approached the site where the camera had captured the figure, Coda halted in a spooky calm that only made them more anxious. Ben knelt next to him, straining his ears as his body remained tense and his nostrils twitched. The distinct sound of boots crunching on twigs Collins Ben was followed by a slight rustling sound coming from ahead. "I know you're there. Show yourself," he said, his voice piercing the stillness. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then a low, derisive laugh came from the shadows, and Collins' face came into view. He was carrying a leash with a metal clasp that was swaying slightly, partially illuminated by Ben's flashlight. Colin remarked in a calm but ferocious tone, "Coda was meant for greatness, Ben," while continuing to defend what was rightfully mine. Ben gripped the walking stick tighter, his heart racing. "But you've made him weak. He's not yours, he never was." Collins moved closer, his smile waning. "You've only touched the surface of what he's capable of. First, allow me to demonstrate the tension between man and dog." Coda barked and stepped in front of Ben, as though to protect him. Collins raised his hands in a mocking gesture, a silent declaration of their kinship that was evident. "Always the faithful one, huh?" However, loyalty has its limitations, and the argument got out of hand. Collins' expression changed from arrogant to dangerous as he advanced one more step. "Turn him over, Ben. You know you can't win this battle," but Ben didn't back down. "Coda isn't going anywhere. You've stolen enough from him already," he says in a forceful voice. The confrontation seemed to go on forever, but Collins ultimately sneered and retreated into the shadows, saying, "This isn't over." As he vanished into the trees, Ben's voice trailed off, and he let out a loud breath, releasing Coda's hold on the walking stick. Sarah put a comforting hand on him and gently nudged him, his eyes sweeping the area as if to make sure the threat was really gone. You did well on Ben's shoulder, but we must get ready because he won't give up. The weight of the confrontation hovered in the air as Ben and Sarah nodded, his determination hardening. Upon returning home, Coda strolled between them, his ears fluttering at every noise in the forest, experiencing the sensation of. Inside the house, Colin's presence persisted like a shadow that would not go away. Sarah added, "We need to figure out his pattern," and took out her laptop to connect the CCTV tape. Her tone was tense, but she was concentrated. "If he has been here before, he will return," Ben paced the living room, periodically glancing at Coda, who was lying on the rug but was still vigilant, raising his head at. Ben murmured, "He knows the land better than we do, every creak of the floorboards. He's waiting for the ideal opportunity while playing games." Sarah nodded and typed frantically. "Then, in order to stay ahead of the game, let's install more cameras and motion detectors farther into the forest." Sarah spent the next few hours strengthening the property because she needed to see him approaching before he got too close. Coda remained nearby, while Ben tried to reinforce the windows and locks with infrared sensors around the perimeter. As they massaged Ben's mind, they followed him with a resolute face, as though they could sense the seriousness of the issue. Reminisced about his police career, recalling the exercises he and Coda had done together, directives and the relationship they had established. Coda had been more than just a companion. He had been a lifesaver, a link to something bigger than the chaos of their surroundings. "Ben, do you think he'll give it another go tonight?" Sarah looked at him gravely as he checked one of the just-put-in locks, asking if I know anyone who Collins, who thrives on dominance, will arrive when he believes we are at our most vulnerable. Ben sat at the kitchen table as night fell and the home became eerily quiet. Sarah was in the living room, keeping an eye on the situation with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long ago gone cold. Coda was lying close to the door, his eyes open and his ears attentive, according to camera feeds. Every creak in the house was tense, which made them feel more uneasy at the time. Around midnight, Sarah's laptop began to beep faintly due to motion sensors, and then a stranger strolling along the tree line in blurry video whispering, "He's here, Sarah." Ben's heart pounded as he observed the screen. Collins moved with deliberate movements, her hand automatically reaching for her sidearm. Precision remained just out of the direct line of sight of the camera, demonstrating his familiarity with the terrain by using the shadows too. Coda's advantage was that he stood rigidly, staring at the entrance with a low. Ben seized a flashlight and a large crowbar, while nodding as a growl rumbled in his throat, signaling that danger was imminent. Sarah hesitated, but in the end, we decided to approach him before he got to the house so that we could prevent him from getting too close. "Agreed, keep near, and don't do anything careless," she said firmly. They went outdoors together into the chilly night air. The woods were strangely quiet, with the crunch being the only sound. With their feet on the icy surface, Kodo advanced, his nose down to the ground, his steps methodical and, with concentration, they followed the motion's path and noticed the dim red lights flickering as they went by each one. Koda froze, hardening his muscles and letting out a harsh growl as he approached the property's edge. Intensified, and he abruptly swiveled his head to the left, where Sarah muttered. "Collins!" Ben yelled out in a calm voice, pointing toward a shadowy figure that was partially hidden by the woods, but with enough rage to prove it. The figure moved steadily forward under Ben's flashlight beam. With a leash in his hand, Collins's face was illuminated and he appeared unconcerned, his lips twisting into a sly smirk. Ben Collins, the same one from earlier, with his other hand comfortably resting on his belt. Sarah moved forward with her weapon drawn, as he made fun of you for being preoccupied. She responded, "You're trespassing. Leave now, or I'll call for backup." Collins. He chuckled, saying that nothing would change despite the eerie, low backup sound. Ben clenched his fists and said, "You know why I'm here? That dog is mine." Standing in front of Coda, he whispered, gritted his teeth, "He was never yours." Collins's smile changed to a steely stare as Collins said, "Don't own him. He's more than a tool for your sick experiments." Ben shook his head, saying, "You're wasting his potential if you don't understand what he's capable of." Steadfast. "He is not a machine to be used and then thrown away. He is my family and my partner, and I will do everything in my power to keep him the The tension peaked as Collins stepped forward, his hand reaching for his belt, and Coda's snarl became more audible. Sarah raised her firearm, her finger hanging over the trigger, her body falling as though she were about to jump. "This is your—" Her final warning was to go immediately, or I'll use force. Collins hesitated. For a little period, his eyes darted between Ben, Sarah, and Coda, as if he might push harder, but he sneered and retreated into the shadows. "This isn't," he continued, his voice dripping with venom. "You'll see," and so on. Ben let out a strong sigh of adrenaline as he vanished into the darkness as quickly as he had appeared. Feeling unsteady, he crouched next to Coda and ran his fingers over the dog's fur. "Good boy," he said in a voice full of appreciation. "We're not letting him win." Sarah put a hand on Ben's shoulder and said softly, "Hey, be back." Ben knew one, but the three of them came home with a stronger resolve than before. The war was far from finished. The night went by in a fog of restlessness, but he and Coda would undoubtedly face whatever happened next together. In anticipation, Ben sat in the living room and gazed at the security monitor, each shadow on the screen flickering. Sarah was sitting close by, carefully cleaning her sidearm with her focus razor as his heart raced. Coda was alert as he laid by Ben's feet, his body taut, and his eyes darting around the room as though he were about to pounce at any moment. Sarah murmured softly, breaking the dark pause, "When HEK returns, guys like. Don't just leave, Collins." Ben nodded, his mouth clenched, "And I'm counting on," he answered, looking down at Coda, who cocked his head as though he understood the significance of what he had spoken. "We wrap up this time at roughly 3 in the morning. Once more, the motion sensors activated. The screen flickered to life, revealing that Collins had returned. But this time, he wasn't alone himself. 2 people emerged from the trees. Ben's gut dropped as Collins brought back up the faint forms that were attempting to flank us, Sarah. The voice was strained as she reached for the radio and called for help, but they both knew it would take at least an hour. Coda had to hold the line while standing apart, his body and ears alert. Ben knelt next to him, staring him in the eye, ready to act. "Stay with me." Ben and Sarah proceeded to the front of the house and positioned themselves close to the front door. He murmured, "We've got this." Windows. They turned out the lights to conceal their movements and used the dim moonlight to direct them. Coda remained to Ben's side, sending a warning rumble across the room with his low growl. And then there were footsteps. Purposeful, measured approach from several angles. Ben's hold on the. As he and Sarah looked at each other, the shotgun tightened. Sarah nodded to Kurt, her finger resting on the trigger of her. Ben yelled, "Weapon, show yourselves," his voice piercing the silence. Ben. Collins yelled, "I'll take back what's mine," as a spooky laugh reverberated from the woods. "You can't protect him forever." A person ran for the back door in the initial onslaught, but Sarah was prepared and fired a warning shot. The figure staggered back and fled into the shadows at the sound of the gun crack reverberating through the night. Collins mockingly raised his hands as he came out of the tree line, taunting Ben, "You know how this ends." Ben walked forward with his shotgun leveled directly at Collins, saying, "You don't scare me. Hand him over, and nobody gets injured." "You're not taking him," he replied firmly. Collins grinned. "It's not about fear. It's about power, old friend. You've seen what he's capable of, and he belongs to someone greater than you." Ben's hand trembled a little from the pressure of the situation, but Coda moved the German before he could react. Coda leaped for Collins with such ferocity that Shepard sped by him in a flurry of motion, going directly for Collins. Took everyone by surprise as Collins staggered back, his hands flying up to protect himself from the Coda's snarl. Furious, baring his teeth as he protected his house and his companion, Collins yelled, "Get him off." Ben was in a panic, hurried forward, and yelled for Coda to get down. The command was issued authoritatively. To Ben's relief, Coda complied, taking a step back, but maintaining a defensive posture. The dog's gaze never left Collins' growl. Sarah moved to shield Ben with her weapon trained on the other figures in a low rumble that spoke unflinching loyalty. "You have no jurisdiction here," she murmured icily, lurking in the shadows. "Law enforcement officers are trespassing and threatening to take you and Collins if you don't leave right away." He growled, "This isn't over," and went forward. "You're making a mistake, Ben," he said. "That dog is wasted on you." His tone was calm, but forceful. "The mistake was assuming you could take him away from me. He isn't a tool to further your goals." Collins gave him a stern look, but there was no hiding the fact that he is my partner. He turned on his heel, defeat in his eyes, and motioned to the others to back off. "You'll regret this," he yelled over his shoulder before vanishing into the trees, and the night became quiet again, but for the sound of retreating. Sarah's shoulders slumped in relief as Ben lowered his shotgun. Rapidly exhaled, releasing her hold on her firearm as she stated, "We did it." With a hint of incredulity, Ben knelt next to Coda and ran a hand over his fur. "Good boy," he said in a heartfelt tone. "You saved us," Coda nuzzled. That night, the connection between them felt greater than ever as his body relaxed against him. As the excitement wore off, Ben and Sarah locked the house's doors and windows before crashing onto the couch. "Leaving behind fatigue and a deep sense of relief. You believe he'll return?" Sarah inquired, interrupting Ben's silence. Looked off into space for a while before shaking his head. "Possibly, but then, when we're ready." Ben reached down and scratched behind Coda, who was lying at his feet with his eyes half closed but awake. "His ears work as a team," he added quietly, adding that nothing would alter the three. The events of the night weighed heavy on them as they sat in silence. But as the first rays of dawn appeared the window, a feeling of calm descended upon the space where they had fought the storm together. And that was plenty for the time being. The first rays of daylight entered the chamber, illuminating the aftermath of the. On a terrifying night, Ben, Sarah, and Coda were sitting in the living room, their quiet broken only by a faint hum of the kitchen refrigerator. It seemed unreal, as though the night's events were still some far-off nightmare. Ben gazed at Coda, who was lying at his feet, and they all realized that the experience was far from done. Ben's serene exterior belied the slow, regular breaths that caused his chest to rise and fall. Felt the residual strain in his muscles, and Coda, like Ben, was constantly prepared for the next battle later that morning. When the local sheriff's squad came, Sarah gave them a debriefing as Ben patrolled the property's perimeter. Although the yard appeared to be undisturbed, Coda was looking for any traces that Collins or his men might have left behind. Sarah remarked that she joined Collins outdoors because she couldn't get rid of the impression that Collins doesn't give up so quickly. Looked at Coda, who was standing watchfully next to Ben, but neither of us did. Ben nodded his head. "Because I can see he's pursuing something other than Coda. There is something that Coda can do, but it's not accessible." Sarah scowled as her thoughts raced through what Ben had said. "When Collins returns, there won't be any idle threats. Therefore, we must be prepared." As time went on, Ben built more security measures around the property, including hidden cameras, and Sarah kept a careful eye on their communication systems while motion sensors were placed around the perimeter to make sure they could quickly notify reinforcements if necessary. But Coda appeared restless in the interim. Ben hadn't noticed the German Shepherd's restless energy before, but it replaced his customary stoicism. He sniffed at corners and even growled low as he moved from room to room, seemingly sensing something that no. Ben inquired, squatting next to him, "What's bothering you, boy?" "Coda's." Ben followed him to the back of the house as his ears perked up at his voice, but he continued to roam restlessly. As darkness fell, the atmosphere changed to one of oppression as Coda stood gazing at the trees beyond the property boundary. The calm of the night before came back, shrouding the home in a pall of anxiety. Ben stood by the window, his eyes. Coda sat at his side, eyeing the tree line, his body tense and suddenly ready. The security monitor screen illuminated with movement as the motion sensors blared to life, and many persons appeared. Collins had returned from the woods, and his numbers had doubled Sarah's this time. Sarah rushed into the room with her shotgun in hand as Ben yelled and grabbed it. "We'll hold them off until backup arrives." Sarah looked at the screen, her expression hardening. Ben nodded and Coda followed his deep, deadly snarl as they went into position. His gaze was fixed on the front entrance, as though he was expecting the first assault, which arrived quickly. Collins. Men approached methodically and with precision, and Ben and Sarah held their ground while firing warning shots to keep them at bay. But the assailants weren't discouraged and started examining the property's vulnerabilities, dividing into separate groups to examine the defenses. Ben turned as Coda snapped his head and barked furiously toward the back of the house. Sarah hurried to protect the back as he yelled, just in time to see a shadow dart past the window, attempting to flank us. Coda stayed by Ben's side at the entrance, watching every movement outside as the attack took place. When Coda's instincts became more acute, he ran toward the side window and began to bark. Ben pursued furiously, spotting one of Colin's guys trying to break through without hesitation. Coda. Ben cried, "Coda, no, no," but it was too late outside when he leaped through the window glass, shattering everything around him. The assailant screamed and dropped his weapon as his strong jaws clamped down on the intruder's arm. Ben hurried because of Coda's unrivaled ferocity and loyalty, which drove him to defend his house and companion at all costs. As the dog overpowered the assailant, he covered Coda with his shotgun raised outside. Making sure no other advanced nice lad Ben phoned, his voice was full of pride. With vigor within Sarah, she skillfully repelled another batch of. The radio crackled to alert the intruders that a backup was on its way, but they were still 20 minutes away from the attackers. Regrouped, Collins came out of the shadows and yelled, "You think you've won, Ben," in a venomous voice. Ben pointed his shotgun at Collins and shouted, "This isn't over." He hovered his finger over the trigger, saying, "You've already lost. Coda is not yours and never will be." The two guys said icily as they locked eyes, a quiet struggle for control. Then Collins smirked and raised his palms in jest. Before withdrawing into the night with his men, he muttered, "We'll see about that." The backup crew showed up a short while later. Collins was nowhere to be found, but he later secured the property and caught the intruders who hadn't escaped. Ben was kneeling next to Coda, putting his hand through the dust as it settled. "You saved us again, boy," he said in a whisper, his voice full of. After the fierce battle, Coda finally relaxed his body by leaning against him. Ben shook his head as Sarah walked over her face, looking relieved and exhausted. "You believe that's the last time we'll see him?" "No, but we'll be much more resilient the next time, like the first glimmer of morning." Broke, Ben, Sarah, and Coda remained together by the connection that had brought them together. Despite the storm, they knew they would confront any obstacles head-on together. The early sun painted a serene light is cast over the property by the horizon in shades of orange and gold. Despite the heavy aftermath of the night's events, there was a sense of triumph in the silence as Coda laid in the grass by the porch, his ears perking up a little as he enjoyed the early morning light in. Weeks, his typical alertness was momentarily replaced by a fully relaxed stance. Ben calmly watched from the front door while holding a coffee mug. Coda grinned quietly as he relived the previous night's events in his head. It had been a near miss, but they had survived together, and the connection he believed he had lost with Coda had been not only restored but also strengthened. The rising sun bathed the horizon in shades of orange and gold, making them stronger after enduring the hardships they had endured. The air was heavy with the remnants of the night's events, but the property was bathed in a serene light. Triumph Coda was lying in the grass by the porch, his ears twitching a little as he took in the. For the first time in weeks, his posture was totally relaxed in the morning light. Peace briefly replaced Ben's normal vigilance as he stood by the front door. He watched Coda with a silent smile while holding a coffee mug, his thoughts going over what had happened earlier. The connection he believed he had lost with Coda had not been broken, even though they had survived a near miss that night. Sarah joined him on the porch once they were rediscovered and strengthened by the ordeal they had endured. With her own mug heating in her hands, she gazed out into the yard before focusing on Coda, who was something else. Ben listened as she spoke quietly, her tone containing a mixture of comfort and appreciation. "Always has been. I simply forgot for a moment." His voice was steady, but it was obvious how serious what he was saying was. "But last night, it was simply him that made me realize what really matters. It's not about the past or the suffering we endure. It all comes down to how we spend our current moment." Sarah grinned warmly, "And I believe Coda is aware of how much you both needed each other." Later that morning, Ben approached Coda and knelt next to him, lifting the German Shepherd to help him recuperate. Ben added in a cheerful tone, "We've been through a lot, haven't we?" as his head and expressive eyes met Ben's. "Passionate, but you've never failed me." Coda made a little yet heartfelt tail-wagging gesture. Important since it was his method of expressing his understanding that their relationship was as strong as ever. Ben dug inside his pocket and took out the old training rubber ball, which he held in front of Coda, who became animated. His ears come up instantly. What do you say in the final game before? Ben made a quiet, eager, and satisfied sound when Coda barked breakfast. Coda chuckled and threw the ball across the yard. Then he ran after it, startled, his motions quickening. Seeing him, Ben felt a surge of pride since Coda wasn't simply a. He was a fighter, a guardian, and most importantly, a devoted friend. He was a retired police dog. As the day progressed, and everything started to return to normal, Sarah assisted Ben. Increased property protection while local authorities looked into Collins and his men further. Ben was aware that even though they had successfully repelled the attack, they would eventually encounter another difficulty. However, they would be prepared this time, and by dusk, the house felt different and less tense than it had for so long was gone. And in its place was a calm assurance that Coda had taken up residence on the rug by the hearth, his eyes half. Ben sat on the couch with his hand resting on Coda's back while he slept. As the stars started to appear in the night sky, Ben could hear the dog's steady rise and fall and their soothing, rhythmic breathing. Found himself thinking back on the path he and Coda had followed since they originally joined the police department as partners. Their journey was one of perseverance and trust, from the difficult times of separation to this point of reunion. An unwavering devotion. Coda Ben remarked quietly, disturbing the quiet. There is still a lot of work to be done, but I am confident that we can manage it. The German Shepherd opened one eye and met Ben's gaze. Coda leaned closer to Ben's head and huffed a deep, satisfied sigh. Leaning against his partner's leg was a straightforward gesture that said a lot about their relationship to people who observed their narrative. It was evident that Ben and Coda's relationship was. It was a collaboration built on trust and put to the test, not just a man and dog relationship. Their journey served as a reminder that healing was possible despite suffering and loss. It only required perseverance, and a little faith to tell this tale of resiliency. And if friendship touched you, please take a moment to like this video and follow us on YouTube for more touching stories. Every story we share is lovingly and devotedly created, and we are so grateful for your support. Have you ever felt a particular bond with an animal or were moved by a tale like this? We'd be interested in hearing about it. Remember that posting your personal stories in the comment section below can foster a community of inspiration and hope. To ensure you don't miss our upcoming emotional trip together, please click the notification bell. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story as we honor the relationships that give life its true meaning. Then be mindful of and treasure the relationships that give your life meaning.